May 1945. The war in Europe had just ended, but another competition was already beginning. In the smoking ruins of Nazi Germany, teams of engineers from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union were racing against each other, searching for the same prize. They weren't looking for gold or art treasures. They were hunting for something far more valuable, the secrets of the world's first ballistic missile. Boris Chertok, a 33-year-old Soviet aerospace engineer, arrived in Germany with a singular mission: find everything he could about the V-2 rocket. When he finally reached the Mittelwerk underground factory near Nordhausen, his heart sank. The massive production facility stretched deep into a mountain, but the Americans had already been there. The best personnel were gone. Key documents had vanished, equipment had been stripped away or destroyed. 300 rail cars full of V-2 parts were already heading west to the United States. Wernher von Braun and over 100 of the top rocket scientists had surrendered to the Americans, calculating shrewdly where they'd be allowed to continue their work. As one German engineer put it at the time, "We despise the French, we are mortally afraid of the Soviets, we do not believe the British can afford us. So that leaves the Americans." But the Soviets hadn't come away empty-handed. What Chertok and his colleagues found in the scattered facilities across Thuringia was still extraordinary. Pieces of V-2 rockets, technical drawings that had been overlooked, manufacturing equipment left behind in the rush, and most importantly, German engineers who hadn't made it out in time. These weren't von Braun's inner circle, but they were skilled technicians, production specialists, and scientists who had spent years working on the most advanced rocket program the world had ever seen. They knew how the missiles were built. They understood the systems. They had the knowledge locked inside their heads. The V-2 was unlike anything that existed in the Soviet arsenal. It stood 14 meters tall, weighed over 12 tons at launch, and could strike targets 200 miles away at supersonic speeds. Most incredibly, on June 20th, 1944, a V-2 had reached an altitude of 175 kilometers, becoming the first human-made object to touch space. Germany had fired over 3,000 of these missiles at Allied cities, primarily London and Antwerp, in the final months of the war. They arrived without warning, faster than sound itself. There was no defense against them. The rockets killed thousands of civilians, but even more people, some 20,000 concentration camp prisoners, died building them in the hellish conditions of the underground factories. The Soviet engineers recognized immediately what they were looking at. This wasn't just a weapon. This was the future. The German rocket program had been decades ahead of everyone else. While the Soviets, Americans, and British had been experimenting with small rockets with thrust measured in tons, the V-2 generated 27 metric tons of thrust. It burned liquid oxygen and alcohol in a revolutionary engine design. It had guidance systems that could, with reasonable accuracy, hit a target from hundreds of miles away. Stalin had poured resources into developing a nuclear weapon, but now the Soviets needed something to deliver it. The V-2 showed them exactly what that looked like. Operation Oswiecim. By July 1945, Soviet teams had established the Institute Rabi in Blykorod, led by Boris Chertok. Their mission was to reconstruct working V-2 flight control systems from the scattered remains. They recruited German specialists, offering them contracts and decent working conditions. One of their biggest catches was Helmut Gröttrup, who had been the deputy for electrical systems and missile control at Peenemünde, the German Rocket Development Center. Grotrup had escaped American territory and willingly joined the Soviets. He hoped to lead their program and avoid playing second fiddle to Werner von Braun on the American side. The Soviets initially treated their German recruits well, settling them in mansions and vacation homes. But there was a problem: they couldn't fully trust them. The Germans worked on V-2 reconstruction at facilities like Institut Nordhausen, which grew to employ over 6,000 German workers by mid-1946. They helped Soviet engineers understand every component, every subsystem, every technical detail of the rocket. But Soviet leadership knew this arrangement couldn't last. These were German specialists with knowledge of advanced military technology, and they were still technically on German soil. Some might defect to the West. Others might share secrets. On May 13, 1946, Stalin signed a secret decree. All ballistic missile work, along with the German rocket experts, would be transferred to the Soviet Union by year's end. Ivan Serov, head of the Soviet secret police in Germany, developed a plan. Its code name was Osoaviakim, after a Soviet aeronautical organization. The operation would happen in a single night with no warning preventing anyone from running away. October 22, 1946. It was the day after local elections in the Soviet occupation zone, a deliberate choice to avoid suspicion. In the early morning darkness, Soviet soldiers appeared at homes across the zone. At each house, the scene was the same. A Soviet security officer with an interpreter and armed guards knocked on the door. Half-asleep families opened to find soldiers ordering them to pack their belongings immediately. Trains and trucks stood ready. There was no negotiation, no time to think. Over the course of just a few hours, the Soviets rounded up more than 2,500 German specialists, scientists, engineers, technicians. With their families included, more than 6,000 people were forced onto 92 special trains. The operation swept up experts in aviation, radar, electronics, chemistry, and nuclear technology. But the most important group consisted of 515 specialists who had worked on liquid rocket engines and missile systems. Among them were 170 Germans from the rocket program, including Helmut Grotrup. The trains headed east into the Soviet Union. Most of the rocket specialists ended up in two locations. A large group went to Podlipki, northeast of Moscow, where they would work under Soviet supervision. But the most sensitive group, 76 German engineers, including Grotrup, were sent to a remote island called Gorodomlia in Lake Seliger, about 300 miles from Moscow. It was completely isolated. The perfect place to extract knowledge while preventing any contact with the outside world. The birth of Soviet rocketry. Overseeing this entire operation was a man who would become the most important figure in Soviet space history. His name was Sergei Korolev. Born in Ukraine in 1907, Korolev had been passionate about aviation since childhood. At 17, he designed his first glider. By his 20s, he was pioneering liquid-fueled rockets in the Soviet Union. But in 1938, during Stalin's purges, he was arrested on false charges and thrown into the Gulag. He spent months in the nightmarish Kolyma labor camp, where prisoners died by the thousands. His health was destroyed, but he survived only because Stalin realized aeronautical engineers would be needed for the coming war. Korolev was transferred to a Sharashka, a prison design bureau, where he continued working on aircraft even while imprisoned. After the war, still technically a political prisoner, Korolev was sent to Germany to inspect what remained of Nazi rocket operations. What he saw transformed his thinking. When he returned to the Soviet Union in February 1947, he was appointed chief designer and head of Department No. 3 at NII-88, the research institute that would become the heart of Soviet rocketry. His first task was clear replicate the V-2. But there was a challenge. The Soviets had managed to obtain enough V-2 parts to assemble maybe a dozen complete rockets. That wasn't nearly enough. The decision was made to build a Soviet version from scratch using local materials and manufacturing. They called it the R-1. Korolev assembled what he called the Council of Chief Designers, a brilliant bureaucratic maneuver that allowed him to coordinate work across different Soviet ministries and design bureaus. The German specialists helped enormously in these early years. Grötrup's team on Gorodomlya Island worked on improved designs. They helped supervise test launches of rebuilt V-2s at the Kapustin Yar, proving ground in October 1947. When those tests succeeded, it proved that Soviet engineers could operate these complex systems. Yet Korolev remained ambivalent about the Germans. Some historians say he saw them as potential competitors. He wanted to build his own rocket team, not rely on former enemies. As one colleague noted, Korolev had a negative attitude toward German participation from the beginning. And there were other concerns. The military nature of the work demanded absolute secrecy. Stalin's government didn't want Western intelligence learning Soviet capabilities. Having Germans involved created security risks. The solution was pragmatic and cold. Once Soviet engineers mastered the V-2's intricacies, the Germans were systematically excluded from new developments. By 1947, they were frozen out of ongoing research. They continued working on theoretical projects, proposed improvements to range and payload, but none of it moved beyond the design stage. Their work was conducted independently, completely separated from actual Soviet missile development. The German team on Gorodomlya Island remained there for years, essentially imprisoned in comfortable surroundings. In September 1948, the R-1 was tested successfully at Kapustin Yar. No German personnel were present. The R-1 was a near-exact copy of the V-2, standing about 14 meters tall and weighing 13 tons. It looked nearly identical to its German predecessor and had a range of around 270 kilometers. But what mattered wasn't the rocket itself, it was what Soviet engineers learned by building it. They gained hands-on experience with every aspect of large, liquid-fueled rockets. They understood the manufacturing challenges, the propulsion systems, the guidance mechanisms, the materials, science. The R-1 gave them a foundation. Beyond the V-2, from that foundation they built something new. The R-2 rocket, first flown in 1950, extended the range to 600 kilometers and introduced Soviet innovations: a detachable warhead for better stability, improved propulsion, efficiency, refined guidance controls. It stood nearly 18 meters tall. This wasn't just a copy anymore. Soviet engineers were innovating. The R-5 followed, pushing the range to 1,200 kilometers. Then came the R-5M. In 1955, the first Soviet missile armed with a nuclear warhead. These weren't incremental improvements. They were leaps forward. By the early 50s, most of the German specialists had been sent home. The majority left in June 1952 after a cooling-off period designed to ensure they couldn't share timely intelligence with the West. Helmut Grötrup eventually made it to West Germany, where he invented the smart card. But their contribution was already complete. They had helped the Soviets close a critical technological gap in those first few years. The knowledge transfer was essential. Yet what came after was purely Soviet achievement. In 1953, Korolev began developing what would become the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-7 Semyorka. It could carry a nuclear warhead 7,000 kilometers. It used a revolutionary design with a cluster of engines, a concept the German team had actually proposed back in 1949 on Gorodomlia Island, though for political reasons their contribution was never publicly acknowledged. When the R-7 first flew successfully on August 21, 1957, it proved the Soviet Union could strike the United States. But Korolev saw something else. He saw a rocket powerful enough to launch a satellite into orbit. On October 4, 1957, an R-7 carried Sputnik 1 into space, the world's first artificial satellite. A polished metal sphere no bigger than a beach ball transmitting a simple radio signal that said beep, beep, beep to anyone listening. That signal shook the world. The space age had begun, and it began because Soviet engineers had learned from captured German technology, then surpassed it. 4 years later, on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin sat in a Vostok capsule atop another variant of Korolev's rockets. He became the first human being to orbit Earth. When Gagarin returned safely, Korolev's achievement was complete. The Soviet Union had won the first phase of the space race. They had transformed a Nazi terror weapon into the key that unlocked the cosmos. The legacy. Throughout all of this, Korolev's identity remained a state secret. In the West, Werner von Braun became a celebrity appearing on television and in magazines as the face of the American space program. But Soviet authorities kept Korolev's name hidden for security reasons. When Sputnik launched, the Nobel Prize Committee asked Nikita Khrushchev for the name of the chief designer. Khrushchev replied that it was the work of the entire Soviet people. Korolev wrote articles under the pseudonym Professor K. Sergeyev. Even in his own country, most people didn't know his name. Korolev died in January 1966 during what should have been routine surgery. His health had never fully recovered from his time in the Gulag. He had suffered from scurvy and other diseases that left lasting damage. He was only 59 years old. He never saw his plans for a Soviet moon landing come to fruition. After his death, the Soviet space program struggled without his leadership. The N-1 rocket, the Soviet answer to the American Saturn V, failed in all 4 of its test launches. But what Korolev built from those captured German rockets endured. The R-7 lineage led directly to the Soyuz rocket, which is still launching today, the most reliable launch vehicle in history. Every crew that goes to the International Space Station still flies on a descendant of the rocket that Korolev's team developed from studying the V-2. The legacy runs through decades of space exploration, Luna probes to the moon, Venera landers on Venus the Mir space station, and countless other achievements. The story of how Soviet engineers saw the V-2 and realized the future was rockets is more than just a tale of technological espionage. It's about how knowledge transfers between nations, even in conflict. It's about how a weapon designed for destruction became a tool for exploration. It's about brilliant engineers like Boris Chertok and Sergei Korolev, who took scattered pieces of German technology and built something far greater. And it's about how the space age didn't begin with a single nation's triumph, but with knowledge built on the shoulders of those who came before, even if those shoulders belonged to enemies. When those Soviet engineers walked through the abandoned factories of Nazi Germany in 1945, they found more than rockets and blueprints. They found a vision of what humanity could achieve if we pointed our technology toward the stars instead of at each other. They took that vision, learned from it, improved it, and launched it into space. That's how the future began, not with one rocket, but with the determination to take an instrument of war and transform it into an instrument of wonder.